Okay, so this is a devlog showing some work in progress on some God of War mechanics. So we have here a scene where we've got a Mixamo character and we can walk onto this button here, and you'll see that the roller begins rolling, and then as a result the platform goes down. So if I were to walk forward off the button, you can see that it rolls quickly back up, and so the goal here is to be able to, for example, get onto this platform, but we can only do that if it's down. So in God of War, you're able to throw your axe at the moving component to keep it there. So you can see the axe flies toward the target, and then we have this freezing over effect, and the axe stays there. And if we recall it, it will disappear. And so if we were to throw the axe and make it freeze over, now if I step off, you can see that the platform stays in place. So I can then recall the axe, it rotates, and then you can see there's a particle effect, and I move up, and we've managed to get up to a higher point than we were before. So I'll just go through how the process is working for these components. So we first of all have a player object, which is represented as a player, just an empty game object with the model underneath it, and a character controller, and we're using a custom player movement script and an animation controller to be able to basically sort of make it use the attacks and that sort of stuff when it's throwing the axe. So you can see here we have two axes. There's one axe that is always in the right hand in the hierarchy, and so the purpose of this is just to leave it always in the position in the hand where it should be, and then when you're actually throwing the axe, it will set the position of the axe to this other axe to be the position of the one that's in the hand, and the one in the hand will immediately disappear at the same time. And so when you're actually throwing the axe, it's not the one that you're holding in your hand, it's the one that's separate, and that flies toward the target, and then it on hit it'll stop moving and it will freeze in there, and so then you can recall it. So they're being able to throw the axe is just clicking on an object that has a suitable script on it, so it requires that the object has the has the throw axe target behavior, and so if the object has that, it allows you to throw the axe at it. And then so for the roller, we'll go to that in a moment for what it actually has as part of that object. First of all though, the button, so the button basically works that it has a walk-on behavior script. So when you enter as a trigger into the object and the character is a player, you could make it work for any object, but for this case we're using a tag for the player. And then it triggers an event when you walk onto the button, and it triggers an event when you walk off the button. So when you're walking onto the button itself triggers a moving up or moving down to be able to return to position or go down slightly. And so the actual amount that it moves down is set in the inspector panel. So it just moves down 0.1 units, just to create a little drop in the button. So the button for those events, so it has the two different events where it has an entered event and an exited event. And so using those two events, they're listened to by the roller. So the roller over here listens for when the button is stood on. And so when the button is stood on, the cylinder will begin to rotate. And so it will rotate using the, I think it was the freeze over. So it's not the freeze over. Where was the roller? Oh yeah, roller behavior. So the roller behavior has a bunch of different properties for just tracking whether or not it's currently rolling. and it has speeds that allow you to modify how fast it rotates and how far it rotates, and it has a way to be able to get the progress of how much it has rotated. So by using the progress, we're able to then use that for the platform. But essentially, if the button is held down, it will rotate until it sort of reaches the maximum point, or otherwise it will rotate back the other way. And so it will listen for those button events. When the object's enabled, it begins listening to those, and it'll just handle them appropriately as the events occur. So for being able to handle the freezing, so the freeze is a toggle on the roller behavior so that it can know that it needs to stop rolling, and so that will just prevent the motion. And so the freeze is handled by another different script. So we have a freeze over behavior. So when the freeze occurs, it will perform the actual visual of the freeze, and the actual triggering of both of these is handled by the throw axe target behavior. So you can see that it tells the roller object when the axe hits or when the axe leaves to toggle the freeze state to one or the other. So now the roller has also the icicles. So the icicles here allow it to sort of make it more interesting for the visuals of the freeze. So there's a freeze grow behavior, which just simply changes the scale and then has a fade over time for when it disappears. So those are mostly handled just by having the objects pre-placed, and they just disappear when the scene begins. So then the platform, as the final object in this sequence, is handled by using a moving platform behavior script. So the moving platform behavior script, just very simply, when it updates, it lerps toward the progress percent of whatever the roller is, and so as the roller moves, it will also move. And so if the roller freezes, it will freeze wherever the roller was positioned at, and so it's just directly listening. You could have it as an event to trigger when the motion is actually happening, so it doesn't have to be every update, but for this, because there's not very much happening in the scene, it works for this setting. So in terms of the actual shader, so if we look, there's inside of the roller, so for both the cylinder and the two cubes, they're all using a frozen overlay material. So as part of that, it contains a base texture and a freeze texture, and so there's a separate one for each of the stone, where there's a stone-based texture, and then for the wood, where there's a wood-based texture. And then there's basically just a generic ice texture for the freeze. That basically just looks like a sort of a frozen over icy appearance, and you could really use any freeze effect for this as an image, and so this is just a random one that was used that seemed to work well for the effect. So looking in the actual shader graph for that, if we go into the shader, so basically the effect is a combination of using, just expand this to be full, so we just create a amount here to be able to show a random dissolve transparency using a simple noise, and then we change it so that as the frozen amount changes, it will modify basically what the amount of freeze over is. So like if we had 0.5, you can see there's a lot, but it goes all the way up to a max where it's never going to be more than, I think it's half. So it's basically doesn't ever fully freeze over. You're always able to see at least some. So you can see in this last node here. And we've also got an outline that's appearing around the edges of the freeze to be able to sort of highlight that, and so the border is added down the bottom here. So the being able to do the freeze is that there's the transparency for what needs to be transparent of the texture is decided. Then you can see the multiplication with the texture to be able to hide parts of it. And then down the bottom here, we take the whatever the change was in the amount that's visible, and we grab the border and we then turn it essentially into just changing it to a color and giving it that color as an overlay onto the other texture. And so once we've got the texture where it's the frozen effect with the borders, then the final result is pretty much adding the base texture to the freeze texture. So as we change that, so like if we do 0.5, you can see it's very slightly, so it builds up gradually until eventually it reaches 1. So the default would be 0. You can see that there are some tiny blips of the color there. Those aren't really noticeable unless you look really closely at the texture, but you could probably remove those by modifying the addition of the borders slightly. But as we go like to 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, you can see it begins to become visible more and more as you get to all the way to 1. And there's always those little bits which are visible through. So basically the other settings aren't necessarily too important. They just uses mostly default. There's no metallic. You could add some metallic or other settings to be able to change the appearance. But essentially it uses settings to make it just highlight the borders of the freeze coming over onto the wood. Alright, so the only other thing that I have to really show is the particle effect. So for the shatter particle effect, we have a visual effect graph. So particle effect, just open that up. So for the particle effect, it's a combination of two different parts. So we have a spawn rate variable that is exposed, and then we're basically spawning constantly one thing which is going to be the first part of the effect, which is just some smaller icicles, and then we have a smaller by sort of 10% of the time some larger icicles. So the smaller icicles become bigger over time, and then the large ones become slightly smaller, and so they just sort of appear and then they fade out as they are there. So it's basically just a bunch of small ones and some big icicles. So if we look at what that looks like, okay, so if we walk on, and I will freeze it. And then if I recall, so when I recall, you should see both of these points. There's some few big ones and then a bunch of small ones that fall. Alright, that's all for this devlog.